Naval warfare in World War I was mainly characterized by the efforts of the Allied powers, with their larger fleets and surrounding position, to blockade the Central Powers by sea, and the efforts of the Central Powers to break that blockade or to establish an effective blockade of the United Kingdom and France with submarines and raiders. Prelude. The naval arms race between Britain and Germany to build dreadnought battleships in the early 20th century is the subject of a number of books. Germany's attempt to build a battleship fleet to match that of the United Kingdom, the dominant naval power on the 20th century in an island country that depended on seaborne trade for survival, is often listed as a major reason for the enmity between those two countries that led the UK to enter World War I. German leaders desired a navy in proportion to their military and economic strength that could free their overseas trade and colonial empire from dependence on Britain's goodwill. But such a fleet would inevitably threaten Britain's own trade and empire. Ever since the first Moroccan crisis, there had been an arms race over their respective navies. However, events led up to this. Captain Alfred Thayer Mayon was an American naval officer, extremely interested in British naval history. In 1887, he published The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. The theme of this book was naval supremacy as the key to the modern world. His argument was that every nation that had ruled the waves, from Rome to Great Britain, had prospered and thrived, while those that lacked naval supremacy, such as Hannibal's Carthage or Napoleon's France, had not. He hypothesized that what Britain had done in building a navy to control the world's sea lanes, others could also do, indeed must do if they were to keep up with the race for wealth and empire in the future. Naval arms race. Mahan's thesis was highly influential and led to an explosion of new naval construction worldwide. The U.S. Congress immediately ordered the building of 3 battleships. Japan, whose British-trained navy wiped out the Russian fleet at the Battle of Tsushima, helped to reinforce the concept of naval power as the dominant factor in conflict. However, the book made the most impact in Germany. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II had been brought up amongst the Royal Navy. When he visited his grandmother, Queen Victoria, his mother said, "Wilhelm's one idea is to have a navy which shall be larger and stronger than the British Navy." In 1898 came the first German Fleet Act. 2 years later a second doubled the number of ships to be built, to 19 battleships and 23 cruisers in the next 20 years. In another decade, Germany would go from a naval ranking lower than Austria to having the second largest battle fleet in the world. For the first time since Trafalgar, Britain had an aggressive and truly dangerous rival to worry about. Mayon wrote in his book that not only world peace or the empire, but Britain's very survival depended on the Royal Navy ruling the waves. Indeed, the Cambridge 1895 Latin Essay Prize was called Britannicae Maris, or British Sea Power. So when the Great Naval Review of June 1897 for the Queen's Diamond Jubilee took place, it was in an atmosphere of unease and uncertainty. The question everyone wanted to know the answer to was how Britain was going to stay ahead. But Mayon couldn't give any answers. The man who thought he could was Jackie Fisher, then Commander-in-Chief, Mediterranean Fleet. He believed there were 5 strategic keys to the empire and world economic system: Gibraltar, Alexandria and Suez, Singapore, the Cape of Good Hope, and the Straits of Dover. His job was to keep hold of all of them. HMS Dreadnought. When he became First Sea Lord, Fisher began drawing up plans for a naval war against Germany. Germany keeps her whole fleet always concentrated within a few hours of England, he told the Prince of Wales in 1906. We must therefore keep a fleet twice as powerful within a few hours of Germany. He thus began work on HMS Dreadnought. launched at Portsmouth in 1906, and she made all previous warships obsolete. She had steam turbine engines, making her the fastest capital ship then afloat, capable of doing 21 knots, much faster than any submarine. She carried 10 12-inch guns, whereas her biggest and closest competitors carried only 4. Dreadnought's guns were emplaced in 5 turrets, 1 fore, 2 in wing turrets, and 2 aft. Fisher proclaimed, "We shall have 10 dreadnoughts at sea before a single foreign dreadnought is launched, and we have 30% more cruisers than Germany and France put together." German response Admiral Alfred Tirpitz had also often visited Portsmouth as a naval cadet and admired and envied the Royal Navy. Like the Kaiser, Tirpitz believed Germany's future dominant role in the world depended on a navy powerful enough to challenge it. He demanded large numbers of battleships, even when Dreadnought was launched, making his previously constructed 15 battleships obsolete. He believed that eventually Germany's technological and industrial might would allow Germany to outbuild Britain ship for ship. Using the threat of his own resignation, he forced the Reichstag to build 3 dreadnoughts and a battle cruiser. He also put aside money for a future submarine branch. At the rate that Tirpitz insisted upon, Germany would have 13 in 1912 to Britain's 16. When this was leaked out to the British public in spring 1909, there was public outcry. The public demanded 8 new battleships instead of the 4 the government had planned for that year. As Winston Churchill put it, the Admiralty had demanded 6 ships, the economists offered 4, and we finally compromised on 8. Tirpitz had no option but to consider Britain's new dreadnought building program as a direct threat to Germany. He had to respond, raising the stakes further. However, the commitment of funds to outbuild the Germans meant Britain was abandoning any notion of a two-power standard for naval superiority. No amount of money would allow Britain to compete with Germany and Russia or the USA, or even Italy. Thus a new policy of dominance over the world's second leading sea power by a 60% margin went into effect. Fisher's staff had been getting increasingly annoyed by the way he refused to tolerate any difference in opinion, and the 8 dreadnought demand had been the last straw. Thus on January 25, 1910, Fisher left the Admiralty. Shortly after Fisher's resignation, Churchill became First Lord of the Admiralty. Under him, the race would be continued. Indeed, Lloyd George nearly resigned when Churchill presented him with the naval budget of 1914 of £50 million. By the start of the war, Germany had an impressive fleet both of capital ships and submarines. Other nations had smaller fleets, generally with a lower proportion of battleships and a larger proportion of smaller ships like destroyers and submarines. France, Italy, Russia, Austria-Hungary, Japan, and the United States all had modern fleets with at least some dreadnoughts and submarines. Naval technology. Naval technology in World War I was dominated by the dreadnought battleship. Battleships were built along the dreadnought model, with several large turrets of equally sized big guns. In general terms, British ships had larger guns and were equipped and manned for quicker fire than their German counterparts. In contrast, the German ships had better optical equipment and range-finding and were much better compartmentalized and able to deal with damage. The Germans also generally had better propellant handling procedures, a point that was to have disastrous consequences for the British battle cruisers at Jutland. Many of the individual parts of ships had recently improved dramatically. The introduction of the turbine led to much higher performance, as well as taking up less room and thereby allowing for improved layout. Whereas pre-dreadnought battleships were generally limited to about 12 to 17 knots, modern ships were capable of at least 20 knots. And in the latest British classes, 24 knots. The introduction of the gyroscope and centralized fire control, the director, in British terms, led to dramatic improvements in gunnery. Ships built before 1900 had effective ranges of perhaps 2,000 yards, whereas the first, new, ships were good to at least 8,000 yards, and modern designs to over 10,000 yards. One class of ship that appeared just before the war was the battlecruiser. There were two schools of thought on battlecruiser design, British and German. The British designs were armed like their heavier dreadnought cousins, but deliberately lacked armor to save weight in order to improve speed. The concept was that these ships would be able to outgun anything smaller than themselves, and run away from anything larger. The German designs opted to trade slightly smaller main armament for speed, while keeping relatively heavy armor. They could operate independently in the open ocean where their speed gave them room to maneuver, or alternately as a fast scouting force in front of a larger fleet action. The torpedo boat caused considerable worry for many naval planners. In theory, a large number of these inexpensive ships could attack in masses and overwhelm a dreadnought force. This led to the introduction of ships dedicated to keeping them away from the fleets, the torpedo boat destroyers, or simply destroyers. Although the mass raid continued to be a possibility, another solution was found in the form of the submarine, increasingly in use. The submarine could approach underwater, safe from the guns of both the capital ships and the destroyers, and fire a salvo as deadly as a torpedo boat's. Limited range and speed, especially underwater, made these weapons difficult to use tactically. Submarines were generally more effective in attacking poorly defended merchant ships than in fighting surface warships, though several small to medium British warships were lost to torpedoes launched from German U-boats. Oil was just being introduced to replace coal, containing as much as 40% more energy per volume, extending range and further improving internal layout. Another advantage was that oil gave off considerably less smoke, making visual detection more difficult. This was generally mitigated by the small number of ships so equipped, generally operating in concert with coal-fired ships. Radio was in early use, with naval ships commonly equipped with radio telegraph, merchant ships less so. Sonar was in its infancy by the end of the war. Aviation was primarily focused on reconnaissance, with the aircraft carrier being developed over the course of the war, and bomber aircraft capable of lifting only relatively light loads. Naval mines were also increasingly well developed. Defensive mines along coasts made it much more difficult for capital ships to get close enough to conduct coastal bombardment or support attacks. The first battleship sinking in the war, that of HMS Audacious, was the result of her striking a naval mine on 27 October 1914. Suitably placed mines also served to restrict the freedom of movement of submarines.